Hey, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in another episode of Painting Masters, episode 41, and in this one we'll feature Junwei Dai, a watercolor painter from Singapore. Now, what I love about his work, and you'll soon see, I'm going to let the work speak for itself, but what I want to say is he takes things in a very alla prima fashion, so his style is very direct, which is something I'm trying to develop as well, and this is why I really like it. He has a lot more stylization than what I necessarily want my art to look like, but he does have a layer of approaching it very direct, which is why I really appreciate his work. Actually, after doing the research and everything, I found out his Facebook, and there I could find many more paintings, so unfortunately some of them aren't here. I'm going to put links down below for his to his Facebook page and also to his YouTube channel. He has 2 video processes that are really worth watching. Okay, so without further ado, let's start looking at his works. So here's the first painting I wanted to show you. I wanted to start with a bang. This one is beautiful. I love it, and let me explain why, because I recently am slowly discovering that I like the more direct approach with watercolor. Now, I want my paintings to be a little more realistic than this and a little less stylized. He really stylizes his work in some of his paintings, but the freshness and the directness of it is what I love. And this one has a perfect composition, in my opinion. Notice that, try looking at this almost as an abstract work. If you just look at it from afar, you can see just a bunch of interesting shapes. You get this interesting skyline all around that building and all around this building on the right. These shapes are what makes it look good, not necessarily the fact that this is a building and this is another building and these are people, and it's not even necessarily the light and shadow per se, but more about, think about it just as a bunch of abstract shapes you can't really read as something, but they look good. And in my opinion, the painting has to look good on an abstract level and on a more literal level. And this is a perfect example of that. If you zoom in, you actually look at some of the details, it's beautiful on a literal level as well. Notice here there's a bit of use of opaque paint, so I don't know if it's completely opaque or gouache, but it's probably just a little bit more opaque, because it seems like this was painted wet into wet over a dark area. So the dark part here, and then the maybe wooden beams, perhaps that's these shapes here. Again, the composition is lovely. It supports the idea here of this restaurant scene in a main plaza or something like that. A lot of action, a lot of people sitting down to eat, some people here walking around the street. Notice how there is a good balance of saturation. If you look at this tower building in the background, there's obviously a clock here, and then this is fairly muted, fairly at the back, but then the closer you get, it gets a little more vibrant. There's a lot of blues and reds, more pure and more isolated. And notice this smart play of cools and warms. It's everywhere here. This building in the background, a little muted, still quite warm actually. Around the bottom it gets a little cooler, so a little blue. And here near the focal point, he made sure to give this serious punch of the blue shirt and red table and a tablecloth, and this isn't necessarily the case, and it works really well here as well. You can see this blue in the background and then a strong orange. These 2 colors are very competitive and both kind of give their own thing to the painting, and together it looks excellent. Also, these touches of yellow here, very smart, very clever on multiple different levels. And his stylization is the minimalism in these kinds of, you see the building has nothing in it. It's actually quite crooked. I don't know if that's on purpose, but or that's the real building, but it leans sideways. So I don't know if, again, it's lack of accuracy or just the way the actual building is, or the perspective maybe, but it works out really well. That's his stylization, and actually love it. Let's move on to another one. So here's another one. It's all leaning, which is crazy, but the impression is there. This is much less realistic. I would say you take it even a step backwards. But what I do take from this, and this is important for me to learn from others, even if I don't necessarily want my artwork to look like theirs, is the freshness. Everything is done really in almost 1 or 2 goes. You can see barely anything that's overworked. The colors are fairly pure too. They've been put there with minimal mixing, which is what I love. I want my look to be more realistic, but I do want it to have that freshness, which is a challenge. How do you maintain the realism without losing the flow and the natural inherent characteristics of watercolor that are beautiful? Here there could be use of opaque paint as well. I'm not sure if this white, perhaps it was added as opaque paint. I don't know, because this is a very non-typical way of the colors blending in, so who knows. This looks kind of like Venice, but I don't know. I think, yeah, it says Venice here, so probably Venice, with all these sticks in the water. Very beautiful, very direct approach that I really appreciate, and you have to judge it in its own right. So you can't really compare this kind of work to a highly realistic work by other artists. I think this kind of lands in its own field, and I love it. Let's move on. We don't have many paintings to go over. I want this episode to be fairly quick. Here's a more rigid feeling painting, and perhaps that's what he was aiming for here. So you can see the difference. This is very flowy, very soft edges, feels very wet, feels like there's moisture in the air almost. And this is a sharper scene. To me, that actually looks like a high mountaintop scene, maybe a village in the mountaintop. Still has that element of using some opaque paint for the reds here. You can see it's very dominant. A lot of scratching, not scratching, but dry brushing. But it still balances out with some softer areas. You look at this, you don't even know necessarily what you're looking at. For me, it looks like a bunch of buildings with a path between them in a village that's high up in the mountains, with this nice patch of flowers and foliage here. But who knows, it could be something else. But it still works. And this is actually a good example of why the abstract concept works. This is almost abstract. You can barely tell what it is. It's an abstract manifestation of a real scene. And it works because our brains enjoy that kind of thing. It's still quite representational. It's not as close to abstract as some of the more modern works you'll see. It's definitely not just a colored square like a Rothko painting, but it is quite abstracted. Here's another one. Sorry for the quality. I couldn't find many high resolution photos, but this is a beautiful one as well. And notice the proficiency of Wet n Wet. He really knows what he's doing. This, you can tell it's a building, and then there are some columns supporting it, and the rooftop, and the shadows. You see everything, but it's all done Wet n Wet with great control. And how these two areas of the painting complement each other. This is very soft on the right. This is sharper and much more detailed on the left. Still quite soft compared to other works of artists you'll see. But notice how he got in this dry brush stroke amidst all the blurry areas, perhaps done with opaque paint as well. He seems to love that kind of thing. And then we have that boat in the foreground. So we have a good balance of kind of foreground, middle ground or backdrop for the boat, and then this background here that's very blended. Notice how he did stick the poles in the water in a sharper, harsher manner, so that really contrasts with the background. And these are all different elements you can play with. Do you want a sharper contrast of values, a sharper contrast of colors, a sharper contrast of edges, like in this example, or you want to soften these elements up, and you can have a sharp contrast in one area and then a softer contrast in another. So your work can be fairly muted and gray, which leads to a small contrast in the temperature, but then you can have a strong contrast in value. So you will have really dark grays and really light grays. And all of these are what makes an artist's work their own work, because you can really tell the signature moves that every artist chooses to take. Some prefer for example, Joseph Zbukvic, he goes very gray, so there isn't a lot of plays in temperature. It's very subtle, but the values are on point many times. Sometimes he'll break off that pattern as well. Here's one of my favorites here, really. I love this one, and I think it's due to the interesting negative shapes here. So you see this building was essentially painted by painting the area around it with the foliage and merging that with the houses here, with this church. And it's all kind of crooked and skewed, but it still works out beautifully. And then we have the cafe or restaurant here in the foreground. So a lot of good balancing acts between sharps, blurred areas, some temperature plays. It all works together in a beautiful, harmonious way, and he's really a master of that. And I love this kind of work. And of course, strong sense of light, which I personally love. That's a preference. You know, there are many different manifestations of light in painting. Different artists do different things. Here's another one. This was a quick demo he did. By the way, you need to check out his YouTube channel. I'll link everything down below. He has a channel with 2 processes only, but it's interesting to see. So again, very simple, very direct. This is a very typical kind of work you'd see plein air. Just capturing the essence of the scene and moving forward. And here, he even abstracted it more, so you can see how the abstract elements work well. So again, a lot of variation in the colors, variation in the values, soft and hard edges. So all of this comes to play together to create a beautiful result. Let's see what else we have here. This one, another beautiful one. This is a little too muted for my taste. I actually like his more colorful works, but still a beautiful composition. Very interesting layering of the rocks and the water breaking against them, and then obviously the city in the background with some trees. Very muted, very subtle color scheme. Notice these quick brush strokes, very dry on the rocks to create that beautiful contrast. Lovely work, and the reflections are soft amidst all the sharpness and harshness of this. I wonder if you use masking fluid for this, or maybe opaque paint, as I mentioned several times before. Here's another beautiful one, feeling of a bit of a wet scene, so not too harsh contrasts, and the reflections of the people on the ground, which is something I love a lot. Again, a fairly muted and subtle color scheme. This really looks like a plein air, very soft and quick and alla prima feeling to it. And this is the last one that I want to share with you. I love this. Notice the dominant red here. I believe this is Chinatown. I don't know where, though. I can't read the cursive writing. It could be New York, could be San Francisco. It looks to me more like, not like New York, but who knows. But in any case, notice how a big mess of reds and pinks and some blues conveying a bustling market scene. And all you need really is of these wires running around, some hints of awnings and shades, and then the people. And your brain kind of completes it. You can see this is another awning and maybe a storefront, an open store. You know, so very easily you can tell what you're looking at, even though you are not given many hints. And the challenge of pulling it all the way back to almost abstract composition and still having it read as something is something I really am attracted to. I want to do more of that. Maybe with a little less stylization, as I mentioned. But in any case, this is the last one. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and now we can wrap it up. So this is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. As you see, I don't do heavy research on the artists I feature here. I really want the art to kind of speak for itself. You could go online and check out more of his information, again, on the Facebook page, YouTube channel, and also on his website. I'm going to link down everything I can find below. I do know that he at least has education in architecture. He probably is also an architect, but from what I could gather, right now watercolor is the main focus, which is amazing. This is a very common trajectory. I see people going through architecture, learning it, and then becoming successful as painters and kind of leaving that aside. Some do it at the same time. I don't know about him. You'll do your research story about that. I'm more interested in the actual art. But I want to thank you so much for watching this one. It's good to be back once again. I mentioned this in all the recent videos. Had a really good time in New York, and now I'm happy to go back to work and help as much as I can to inspire maybe someone, 1 or 2 people to paint more, create more, and be more brave about that kind of thing. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next vid.